The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the small city streets. Amara Johnson, a poised and confident woman in her early 30s, hummed along to the soft jazz playing on her car radio. Her day had been long but productive, and now she was on her way to pick up her daughter, Layla, from after-school art class. The thought of seeing Layla's bright smile always lifted her spirits. As she drove along the quiet suburban road, she noticed a police car pull up behind her, its lights flashing. Amara frowned, quickly glancing at her dashboard. She was well within the speed limit. Why was she being stopped? With a calm demeanor, she signaled and pulled her car over to the side of the road. Amara reached into her glove compartment to retrieve her registration and insurance card, then placed her hands firmly on the steering wheel. She had taught herself to stay composed in such situations, knowing that remaining calm was often the best approach. The officer, a tall man with a stern face and a badge that read Bradley, approached her window. His expression gave away no friendliness. Instead, he leaned in and tapped the glass with his flashlight. "License and registration," he said flatly, his tone lacking any politeness. Amara rolled down her window and handed over the documents. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" she asked, her voice steady but polite. Officer Bradley didn't respond immediately. He looked at her license and then at her, as though sizing her up. "Do you know how fast you were going?" he finally asked, his tone sharp. "Yes, sir," Amara replied evenly. "I was driving 30 miles per hour, which is the speed limit for this road." Bradley raised an eyebrow, his lips curling slightly. "You were going faster than that," he said, shaking his head. "I clocked you at 40. Amara frowned but kept her composure. "That's not possible. I've been monitoring my speed the entire time. I even have an app on my phone that tracks my driving." Her calm explanation didn't seem to sit well with the officer. His eyes narrowed, and his tone turned colder. "Step out of the vehicle, Mom," he ordered. Amara hesitated. "Is there a specific reason, officer? I'd like to understand what I did wrong." Bradley's hand rested on his belt, and his voice grew firmer. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now." Amara's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear show. She took a slow breath and reached for her phone. "I'd like to call someone before I do," she said firmly, meeting his eyes. Bradley scoffed. "Call whoever you want. It won't change a thing." Amara quickly dialed her husband, David Johnson, who also happened to be the mayor of the city. Her hand shook slightly as she waited for him to answer, but her resolve remained strong. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up to something bigger. Amara's phone rang on the third ring. It was David. "David," Amara said quickly, her voice calm but firm. "I need you. I've been pulled over, and this officer is being difficult." "Stay calm. I'll be there soon," David replied, his voice reassuring. "Don't do anything until I get there." She felt a small sense of relief at hearing his voice, but she could still feel her nerves tingling. She kept her hand on the phone, ready to update David if needed. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley stood silently beside her car, eyes fixed on her. He had yet to make any further comments, but his stare felt uncomfortable. Amara could sense that something wasn't right. The longer he stood there, the more the silence grew. She tried to ignore the way he was looking at her, but couldn't help but feel uneasy. A few moments passed, and Officer Bradley broke the silence with an unexpected question. "Where are you headed, ma'am?" Amara was caught off guard. It wasn't a question related to the traffic stop. "I'm on my way to pick up my daughter," she replied, still keeping her voice steady. "I don't understand why I was stopped." Bradley's gaze didn't soften. Instead, he glanced at her license again, and his lips twisted into a slight sneer. "Really? You sure you're not hiding something?" Amara blinked, her patience wearing thin. "I'm not hiding anything. I've done nothing wrong." His tone turned more mocking now. "No need to get defensive. I've seen it before. People like you always think they can get away with things." Amara felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to argue, not when she had someone to call for help. She quickly shot a glance at her rearview mirror and noticed a few cars driving by, some of them slowing down to watch the interaction. She wasn't sure if it was good or bad, but it made her feel like she wasn't alone. Suddenly, Bradley stepped back from her car and gestured for her to roll down the window even further. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. "I could take you in right now, you know." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "Take me in? For what?" "For resisting, for wasting my time. You're being difficult, and I'm just trying to do my job," he responded, his voice full of irritation. Amara held her ground. "I'm not being difficult. I've been respectful, but I need to know why you stopped me." He paused, as if deciding whether to respond or not. After a moment of hesitation, he let out a long sigh. "You're lucky I'm even being reasonable. I'm just going to give you a warning this time. But if you keep arguing, I won't hesitate to take you in." Amara's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but she said nothing more. Instead, she focused on the sound of her husband's reassuring voice in her ear. She could feel the support coming from David, even though he wasn't physically there yet. "I'll wait for him," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "My husband is the mayor of this city. He's on his way here right now." The officer's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Fine. Wait for your mayor," he said, turning away with a frustrated mutter under his breath. "But don't think this means I won't be keeping an eye on you." Amara ignored his words, focusing instead on the fact that David would be arriving soon. As she waited, she knew the situation was about to change. Amara could feel the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing moment. Officer Bradley was still standing beside her car, his arms crossed, staring down at her with an expression that was both cold and dismissive. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. David would be here any minute now. The thought gave her some comfort, but the more she sat in the uncomfortable silence, the more her frustration grew. Her fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel as she kept her eyes on the officer, watching his every movement. He hadn't said anything for a while now, but his presence felt more menacing with each second. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the peaceful hum of the city, the distant sounds of the wind and passing cars. But then, without warning, Officer Bradley stepped closer to her window again. His shadow loomed over her, blocking out the sunlight. "You're taking too long," he muttered, his voice low and stern. "If your husband is really on his way, he better hurry up." Amara felt a slight flutter of unease, but she didn't let it show. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She wasn't about to let this officer bully her into feeling guilty. "He's on his way," she said calmly, trying her best to keep her voice steady. "I've told you that." Bradley didn't seem to care about her words. Instead, he leaned closer, his face now just inches from hers. His eyes narrowed as he spoke again, almost whispering. "You're lucky I'm not arresting you right now. I could make your life very difficult, you know." His breath was warm against the glass, his words filled with an unspoken threat. Amara's heart skipped a beat. She refused to let him intimidate her. She wasn't afraid of this officer. She knew her rights, and more importantly, she knew her husband's influence. Still, the idea of being arrested, even falsely, didn't sit well with her. Taking a deep breath, she looked him in the eye. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You're the one making this difficult, not me." Bradley straightened up, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "You think you can talk to me like that because your husband is the mayor? You think that gives you power?" Amara didn't flinch. "I think it means I have the right to be treated with respect, just like anyone else," she replied evenly. The officer stepped back slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on her. He seemed to be weighing his next move, and for a moment, Amara felt a surge of anger. She wasn't going to be intimidated into silence. But then she remembered that David would be here soon. She could hold on just a little longer. As if on cue, a car pulled up behind them, its engine cutting through the tension that had been hanging in the air. Amara couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, though she didn't let her guard down just yet. She turned her head slightly and saw David stepping out of the car, his face calm but serious. Bradley turned his head as well, his expression hardening. David walked toward them with purpose, his every step measured. Amara knew that the officer would now have to answer to her husband. The power dynamics were about to shift. Amara's pulse quickened as she saw David approaching from behind the officer. She knew he was a calm and measured man, but something about the situation made her feel a sense of urgency. She had to hold it together just a little longer, and soon things would change. Officer Bradley had taken a step back when David arrived, but his posture still felt threatening. The officer wasn't going to back down easily. Amara felt the weight of the tension between them, but now she wasn't alone. She could feel the support of her husband just by looking at him. As David walked closer, Amara turned to him, her voice calm but filled with a quiet urgency. "David, this officer has been harassing me. He stopped me for no reason and is threatening to arrest me." David looked at the officer, his face a perfect mask of composure. "Amara," he said softly, his voice full of care and reassurance. "I'm here now. Don't worry. I'll handle this." The officer stood stiffly, his hands on his hips, waiting for David to speak. "Officer Bradley, is it?" David asked politely, his eyes fixed on the officer's badge. "I'm Mayor David Johnson, and my wife just explained what happened. I'd like to understand why you've chosen to escalate this situation." Amara saw the officer's expression falter for a moment. There was a brief flicker of unease before Bradley quickly regained his composure. "Mayor or not, I'm just doing my job," he said, his tone now laced with defensiveness. "She was speeding, and I was about to take her in for resisting." David's calm demeanor didn't waver. "I've been informed that my wife was driving well within the speed limit, and yet you chose to escalate things rather than simply issuing a warning." He paused for a moment, glancing at Amara, who gave him a small, appreciative nod. David turned his attention back to the officer. "If you're going to treat my wife this way, there's something wrong here. I'm afraid I'll have to take this further." His voice was still polite, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. Amara could see that the officer was uncomfortable now, his previous confidence starting to crack. He wasn't prepared for the mayor to step in and challenge his actions so directly. His stance shifted slightly, as if unsure how to respond. "Sir, with all due respect," David continued, "I think it's time for you to explain yourself. This is not the way to handle a simple traffic stop." Bradley's face flushed slightly as he struggled to come up with an answer. I'm just following protocol," he stammered, clearly caught off guard by David's composed challenge. She was being uncooperative. David's eyebrows raised at the claim. "Uncooperative?" he asked. "My wife remained calm and respectful throughout this entire encounter. It's you who has been aggressive from the start." The officer shifted nervously on his feet. Amara could see the tension in his body language now, his posture less sure than it had been when David first arrived. She felt a slight surge of relief. The situation was starting to turn in their favor. "Let's not waste any more time, officer," David said firmly. "I think it's best if you step aside and let my wife go. If you have further concerns, we can discuss them later. But for now, this stop is over." David's presence was clearly starting to make an impact. The officer didn't argue, but he muttered something under his breath before stepping away from Amara's car. Amara could hardly believe it. She watched as the officer walked back to his patrol car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She turned to David, grateful for his calm authority. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with relief. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." David smiled warmly at her. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." As the officer reluctantly walked back to his patrol car, Amara let out a quiet sigh of relief. She had been holding her breath, waiting for something to shift in her favor. Now, with David at her side, she felt more secure. The tension that had built up in her chest slowly began to ease. David glanced at her, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling in Amara's mind. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. He stepped closer to the car, reaching out to rest a hand on the door. Amara nodded, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel. "I'm fine now. But that officer was." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was treating me like I didn't matter." David's eyes narrowed, his protective instincts immediately kicking in. "I know, but you handled it well. I'm proud of you." She gave him a small smile, grateful for his words. "I just didn't expect it to go so far. I thought I was just getting a warning, but then it turned into something else." David sighed and leaned against the car, glancing over at the officer who was still sitting in his patrol car, clearly trying to avoid eye contact. "It's unfortunate," David said, shaking his head. "But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in this city." Amara turned her attention to the officer, noticing how he kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror. It was clear that he wasn't entirely comfortable with how things had unfolded. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But that sympathy quickly faded when she remembered how he had spoken to her earlier. He hadn't given her a single chance to explain herself, dismissing her as if she were beneath him. No one deserved to be treated that way. As the minutes ticked by, Amara noticed the other drivers who had slowed down earlier were now moving on. Some gave her supportive nods as they passed, and a few even smiled, as though to say, "You're not alone in this." David, noticing her gaze, gave a small nod in return. It's good to know people are paying attention. It's times like these that remind me why we keep fighting for change. He paused, looking at Amara with a tender expression. "And it's why I'm so proud of you. You didn't let him intimidate you." Amara felt her heart warm at his words. "I tried my best," she said quietly. "But I'm glad you were here." David smiled, leaning in slightly. "Of course I was going to be here," he said with a wink. "You think I'd let anyone treat my wife that way?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Before David could respond, the officer got out of his car. He was walking slowly, head down, clearly not wanting to draw attention. He didn't look at Amara or David directly, but his footsteps were heavy as he approached them. David straightened up immediately, his posture assertive yet composed. "Officer Bradley," he called out, his voice clear and commanding. The officer flinched slightly but turned to face David. "I think it's time we end this," David continued, his voice firm but controlled. "I'd like to see you back in the station for a full report on what happened here. I'll be reviewing this incident personally." The officer's face turned pale, and he nodded quickly, not daring to say another word. Without another glance at Amara, he returned to his car and drove off, leaving the street peaceful once again. Amara exhaled slowly. The moment felt surreal, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As the officer's car disappeared down the road, she turned to David. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've got my back, always." David smiled softly, his eyes filled with warmth. "Always." As the sound of Officer Bradley's car faded into the distance, Amara and David stood in the quiet aftermath of the tense encounter. The street was calm now, the only sound being the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. But Amara couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't over. She knew the officer hadn't simply given up, and she was right to feel concerned. David, sensing her unease, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "But you handled it perfectly. You stood your ground, and that's what matters." Amara nodded, feeling grateful for his support, but a part of her was still troubled. "Do you think he'll be okay with this? I mean, he didn't exactly look happy when you talked to him." David sighed, his face serious now. "No, he won't be happy. But that's not my problem. We both know how these things work. It's not just about what happens here. It's about making sure that these kinds of things don't keep happening." Amara looked up at him, her gaze steady. "You're right, but he didn't have to treat me like that. Like I was a criminal just for driving." David's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "No one should treat anyone like that. That's exactly why I'm going to handle this. I won't let this slide." Just as he finished speaking, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, glancing at the screen. "It's the city council," he muttered. "I'm going to take this. I'll be right back." Amara watched as he walked a few steps away to answer the call, his posture strong, but his face still holding the stress of the situation. As much as she admired his commitment to the city, she couldn't help but feel a pang of worry. The day had been draining enough already, and now they were dealing with this. She looked down at her hands, her fingers still tightly gripping the steering wheel. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate like it had. She hadn't expected to feel so powerless when the officer had first approached her. But with David by her side, she had found the strength to stand tall. That was something she would never forget. After a few minutes, David returned, his expression still serious but more relaxed. "That was the council. We've got a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss this incident. They're already aware of the situation." Amara raised an eyebrow. "They're already aware?" David nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, they are. I've been pushing for more transparency and accountability with the police force, and this is exactly the kind of situation we need to address. It's time we started holding officers accountable for their actions." Amara felt a sense of relief wash over her. David was always one step ahead. She could see how much he cared about making things right, not just for her, but for everyone in the community. It made her proud to stand by him, even when things got tough. "You're amazing, you know that," Amara said, her voice soft, but filled with admiration. David chuckled, a warm glint in his eyes. "I'm just doing what's right. But thank you. I couldn't do it without you." For the first time in what felt like hours, Amara smiled. The situation wasn't completely over, but with David's support, she knew they would get through it. Together, they could handle anything. The next morning, David's office was buzzing with energy. The phone lines were active, and his assistant was sorting through a pile of reports on his desk. But David was focused on one thing: the meeting he had scheduled with the city council. Today was the day they would begin the process of addressing what happened the night before. Amara sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but thoughtful. She could feel the weight of the situation still pressing on her, but having David there made everything seem more manageable. He had a way of making things feel possible, even when they seemed overwhelming. As they entered the council chamber, Amara noticed the atmosphere was tense. Several members of the council were already seated, exchanging whispers and glances. The room was filled with a mix of people, some supportive of David's efforts for change, others unsure of the direction he was taking. David stood confidently at the front, taking his place behind the podium. He glanced at Amara briefly, offering her a small smile for reassurance before turning his attention to the room. "Thank you for gathering today," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "We are here to address an important issue that goes beyond just one incident. It's about accountability and fairness for everyone in our city." Amara listened carefully, her heart swelling with pride. David wasn't just speaking for her. He was speaking for anyone who had ever been mistreated or unfairly judged. His words weren't just about politics. They were about justice. "I know many of you have questions about last night's encounter," David continued, "and I want to make one thing clear. We cannot tolerate any form of discrimination, especially from those who are meant to protect us. This is about creating a community where everyone feels safe, regardless of their background." Amara could feel the room shift. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination, but the tension seemed to lift a little. David's words were making an impact. He was speaking from the heart, and the council members were listening. "Last night, my wife was treated unfairly," David said, his voice unwavering. "The officer who stopped her violated her rights, and that cannot stand. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to Amara, but to anyone." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the council members nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. But David wasn't done. "I've already spoken with the police chief, and we are beginning an immediate review of the officers' conduct," he continued. "I'm also pushing for more training for all officers in our city to ensure this kind of behavior is not repeated. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about building trust between law enforcement and the community." Amara could see some of the council members' expressions soften. They weren't all in agreement, but David was making it clear that he was committed to real change. He wasn't backing down, and he wasn't going to let his city sweep this under the rug. "Change is hard," David said, his voice gaining strength. "But it's necessary. And I won't stop until we make this city a place where everyone feels safe, heard, and respected." Amara couldn't help but smile as she watched David. He wasn't just her husband. He was a leader who cared deeply about doing what was right. And as the room fell silent, she realized that things were already starting to shift. The city was going to be different because of him. The meeting ended with a mixture of applause and uncertain glances, but David had made his point. Amara stood up, feeling stronger than she had the day before. It wasn't over yet, but with David's leadership, they were on the right path. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. David was working harder than ever, organizing meetings and making sure that the city council's decisions were being followed through. Amara stayed by his side, supporting him in every way she could, but there was one thing they both knew. The battle was far from over. The public attention from the incident was still strong, with media outlets picking up on the story of the officer's actions. Amara had been surprised at how many people reached out to her, offering support, sharing their own experiences, and thanking her for standing up for what was right. It was comforting, but it also reminded her of how many people were still struggling with the same issues she faced. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the cool breeze swept through their home, David received a call. He glanced at the phone screen and immediately stood up from his desk, his expression serious. "It's the police chief," he said, his voice focused. "I need to take this." Amara watched him as he stepped out onto the balcony, his phone pressed to his ear. The tension in his posture told her everything she needed to know. This call was important. A few minutes later, David returned to the room, his expression still serious, but with a hint of relief in his eyes. "The officer who stopped you is being placed on leave, effective immediately," he said, his voice calm but firm. "They're going to conduct a full investigation into his actions." Amara's heart lifted slightly, but she knew that this was just the first step. "And what about the training you've been pushing for?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. David nodded. "The police department has agreed to start a series of workshops for all officers, focusing on de-escalation, bias, and cultural sensitivity. It's a step in the right direction, but we have a long way to go." Amara smiled softly, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "I'm glad you're making it happen. It's not just about us. It's about everyone." David walked over to her, taking her hand gently. "You know, when this first happened, I didn't know how far we'd get. But now I can see real change happening. You were right when you said we have to keep fighting. And I'm not going to stop." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on how much they had been through. The road ahead wasn't easy, but they were in it together. Amara felt a sense of peace knowing that her husband was doing everything he could to make their city better. Later that evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was a call from the local news station. The anchor on the other end of the line wanted to interview David about the progress they had made. They wanted to hear about the changes he was fighting for, not just as mayor, but as a husband and father. David agreed to the interview, and a few hours later, he sat in front of the camera, speaking passionately about his commitment to fairness and justice. Amara watched from the living room, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. She had always known David was a leader, but watching him speak to the community with such conviction reminded her why she loved him so much. As the interview ended, David turned off the camera and walked over to Amara, a smile tugging at his lips. "Well, that's another step forward," he said. Amara grinned back, feeling a sense of relief and accomplishment. "You've done more than that. You've shown people that one person can make a difference." David squeezed her hand. "We've shown them. Together." And in that moment, Amara knew they had already won. Not just the battle, but the fight for a better future. Weeks passed, and the momentum for change that David had started didn't slow down. The media coverage around the incident had sparked conversations not just within the city but across the state. People were beginning to take notice of the steps David was pushing for, and the community was starting to come together in support of the changes. Amara felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she watched the ripple effects of the work they had done. What started as a difficult, painful moment for her had turned into something much larger. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about creating a space where everyone felt safe, heard, and respected. One afternoon, as she was walking to the kitchen to grab a cup of tea, her phone buzzed. It was a message from David. "Council meeting at 6 p.m. I want you there. Big update." Curious, Amara quickly finished what she was doing and got ready. As she arrived at City Hall, she noticed a crowd gathered outside, holding signs that read things like "Fairness for All" and "End Discrimination." It was heartwarming to see so many people who cared about the cause. Some were holding hands, others were chatting together. It was a clear sign that the community was united in their desire for change. Inside the council chamber, David stood at the front, preparing for the meeting. When he saw her enter, he smiled and motioned for her to join him. "Amara," he said softly, "I'm glad you're here. I think tonight will be a turning point." Amara took a seat next to him, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. She could sense that something big was about to happen. The council meeting began, and the air was filled with energy. Several council members spoke about the importance of reform and justice, and there was a palpable sense of optimism. When it was David's turn, he stood up, his voice calm but powerful as he addressed the room. "I know change doesn't come overnight," David said, looking out at the crowd. "But it starts with all of us. It starts with understanding that we are all equal, and we all deserve respect." He paused, letting his words sink in. Amara watched him, her heart swelling with pride. His commitment to justice wasn't just a political stance, it was a deeply personal one. "We've made great strides already, but this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new chapter for our city, a chapter where fairness and equality are the foundation of everything we do. I'm proud of what we've accomplished together, but I know there's still more work to do." The room was silent for a moment before a round of applause erupted. People were standing, clapping, and cheering, their faces filled with hope. It wasn't just applause for David, it was applause for everyone who had supported this cause. It was applause for a community that was finally coming together to make things right. Amara felt tears prick at the corner of her eyes as she looked around the room. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly hopeful. The work wasn't over, but it was no longer just a fight. It was a movement. And it was a movement that was gaining strength with every step. As the meeting ended and people began to filter out, David took Amara's hand. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We've made a difference today, but there's more to do." Amara smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "And we'll do it together." Together, they walked out of the council chamber, knowing that the change they had started was now something bigger than themselves. It was something that would touch every corner of the city and beyond.